Okay, so this is the second to last lecture recording, if I've done this right. And we're just gonna cover structured personality tests a smidge. So this will be the first half. The file is so it's 15 slides. There is some very cheesy GIF animations that I'm going to see if those work. We yeah. Anyway. Uh, yeah, let's kind of get these just done. Tuki is sulking slash snoring. It's hard to tell. I imagine that he will show up again because it's what he does. It's a good thing he's cute. Okay, yeah. So let's just plow through this. So I'm gonna give you some definitions of personality, just so you have them. Because there's a bit more debate, or perhaps at the very least, I have experienced more of the debate. Um, and the other class I teach is a personality class. So yeah, so there's tons of different definitions. But the general trend is like an individual's characteristic patterns of thoughts, emotions, and behaviors together with psychological mechanisms like hidden or not, like behind those patterns. So it's a characteristic pattern, like thought, feelings, behaviors, and they're kind of you. They're not like solely unique in the same way, like in theory a snowflake is, but that pattern is kind of a constellation of traits that are relatively consistent across situations. Often, this area of research focuses on differences amongst people, and so it's called individual differences. And individual differences is a little broader than just saying like personality. So, like, I don't call myself a personality psychologist because I also study intelligence, and so I consider myself as well a quantitative psychologist who focuses on differential psychology and behavior genetics. But that's a mouthful. So, like, I use instead of saying, yeah, I like personality and intelligence because they're interesting, not really into vocational interests or like I, other or attitudes. That's a mouthful. So I just say differential. But in general, like the idea is that like with personality, it's multiple traits and people like don't have to be like absolutely stable, so like you don't have to act the same all the time in all the contexts, but relatively. So uh extroverted folks across situations tend to, whether it be like a funeral or like in front of a class, relative to their peers they behave in a certain way. So while in front of a class even introverts are going to be super talkative because they have to be. I mean, but extroverts are more talkative relative to introverts versus like at a funeral where an extrovert may talk a smidge or versus an introvert. So like the situation can have a big influence, but rank order. So like your percentiles should stay about the same. That's the idea. So we're gonna see how this works. This is a slide. So the goal of personality psychology broadly is to explain the whole person in their daily environment. And so David Funder, who is quite a character, calls this mission impossible. And so please work. Okay, so I spent way too long making this GIF. Yeah, we're gonna watch it because it's animated. Yeah. I'm sorry, I have to entertain myself just a smidge for my own sanity. So we'll see if that worked. But the basic idea is it's really hard to explain the entire person. And most people don't do. They tend to focus on individual pieces. Um, it's a really broad goal. Like one reason why we can get such high reliabilities and validity coefficients for intelligence is it's a really narrow aspect. It's just relative to personality, which is like capturing all those systematic thoughts, feelings, and behaviors versus just like one narrow sliver of like cognitive reasoning and your ability to like figure things out. And I say narrow relatively speaking, it's still pretty broad, as we saw with all the different facets and different layers. But that's the idea. Okay. So like I encourage you to think about an important behavior you performed recently and all of the reasons behind it. There's a lot, right? Even just in me making that like silly little GIF and showing it, like part of it is like I'm just going to detail them here just to give you a sense of like how much goes into like that one little behavior. And you guys kind of already know this, but trapped in my own apartment because of a pandemic, surrounded by 3 very idiosyncratic one cat, 2 kittens. Need some kind of creative outlet because, whew. And so, and also like just the environmental stresses, but also like my general silliness and just curiosity to see if I can do it. How do animations roll in just to see if it's possible? All that goes into me presenting this GIF. Also, it requires that I had to scour the internet for like the exact right scene. And also learn how to, so like there were just so many steps to get to that piece. And like that behavior of showing it like was dependent upon all these other aspects, both environmentally and cognitively and just technologically, all those pieces just built into that. And so that is a really high order, a high bar to set to be able to explain all the aspects of that behavior, of the choice I made to show that GIF. There's a lot of pieces there. Okay, next please. Okay, so I'm going to give you some more definitions beyond just personality. Personality traits are relatively enduring disposition. The reason I'm giving you so many is there's a lot of debate here, and I want to make sure to convey that there is no universal. Even the definition of like intelligence is like as a general factor, there's debate. And here, but just to give you a sense, so it's relatively enduring, tendency to think, act, and feel in a certain manner under any given circumstances. Not everybody agrees with that piece, that any, like, of the universal, like how universal it is, how immune it is to circumstance. But the idea is that it distinguishes one person from another. People differ. So individual differences are all about how do people differ. When people all behave the same way, that's social psych. I find that personally a little less interesting. But that's why we have wonderful people who do social psych. Uh, I like seeing, I do recognize the circumstance piece for sure, but I don't think it's like, it has to be like universal, like, and there's whole debate on this. Whew. You probably heard about it if you took a personality class. Person's first situation debate. It's heated. But I'm not gonna go too deeply into it because I'm mindful that our time and attention is all very precious and rare. So personality traits, the idea is they're stable. And personality states are much less stable. They are predominantly emotional reactions that vary from one situation to another. And this is like and so the big distinguishing feature like states versus traits, and again, this is not universally accepted, that traits are stable across all situations, and anything where there is some situational differences, that's a state-based thing. And that kind of shifts what your trait piece would be, so you could almost like add up the two separate pieces. But so like whatever your trait level is, that's stable, but so like whatever your, say your level of extroversion is like a 5 naturally, but the environment drives, so like it'd be 5 plus whatever the environmental influence is. So if the environment makes you less extroverted in that moment, then the environment, like that state would be like -2. And so the net effect would be 3 from your baseline 5. There's debate on this. There's debate on everything, but like even figuring out how these two work together. But the key idea is that there is some environmental piece, and how you break that up depends. And so you can either like just slice it up or just recognize that there's aspects. Cool. So more definitions. Types. So this kind of refers to like general descriptions of people: avoidant, depressive, INTJ, or whatever the Myers-Briggs is. You can clearly see how often I use it, or it's used, but it's kind of like sorting into groups. It's less, it's easier to describe people. So like think sorting hat, like you're classified into like Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, Gryffindor, Slytherin. Um, and so any nuance, any boundary, like how Harry is almost put in Slytherin because he's on the bubble between those two types, is highlights some problems of typing, but it gives you a general description. So that you can at least, so you don't have to say, oh, they're 98th percentile in extroversion. You can at least give a broad description, and that is helpful for communication. Now, self-concept is a personality's like a person's self-definition. So it's an organized set of assumptions that one has about his or herself, and this can change. And this doesn't have to match up with your actual like self, like your actual behavior. There can be discrepancy here. And so you could think that you're not an introvert, but in fact, or you can think you're an introvert while in fact you're actually an extrovert because all the people you hang out with are way more extroverted than you. So relatively to this weird biased friend group, you're introverted, but objectively you're extroverted. And so there can be discrepancy, and there often is. And improving self-knowledge and learning what your assumptions are and if they're accurate, and learning to work with yourself is a really important skill. And it's because, yeah, you're going to live with yourself a long time, so you might as well get to know you. I cover a lot more detail in my personality class. So yeah, also if anyone's interested, I'm happy to like share the link to those lecture recordings. But yeah, so you've got the kind of cutesy BuzzFeed and slightly step above BuzzFeed, Myers-Briggs, and then above that, like, is the more structured personalities test. So some of these are an attempt to assign types based on measurements of someone's traits. Usually there's some kind of diagnostic criteria. Personality disorders fall into this. So you still have the traits. It's just adding a label can be helpful. That's the idea with these more structured personalities. They aren't all about typing. They tend to give you that trait level information. Same with like the intelligence test, how they have those cutesy classifications. Of like imbecile, idiot. What's the third one? And when I say cutesy, I mean politically incorrect and really uncomfortable. But that's the idea. Like you can have the label to help, but there's still information at the trait level. So strategies to structure tests. There's a lot of thought here, but there are generally like two main approaches. But before we get there, so in general, like subjects are asked to respond to written statements that are designed to minimize ambiguity. These are different from projective tests where subjects have to respond purposely to stimuli that are purposely ambiguous. And that ambiguity is problematic because it makes them less reliable. It's more like subjective. So we're going to focus on the structured piece. So 2 approaches to structured tests. You've got deductive and empirical, and we're going to go through those. So just for full disclosure, I'm an empirical gal. I like them better. I'm much more data driven. Deductive is still effective and has its purpose, but you may figure out, given how I structured this course and how we talk a lot about criterion groups and reference groups and factor analysis, where my preferences are. However, I'm still going to cover both. And in the last little bit of the section, I'll cover deductive, if I recall how I slice these up. So the deductive approach kind of starts with kind of logical, content-based, intuitive, rational, theoretical. Like it's person-driven. So like you go from kind of construct, so you go from like construct, the basic idea, to then generating the questions. It's more theory driven than the empirical approach, which, I mean, they're both got some theory, but the empirical kind of focuses more on like the data and uses the data to develop the test. So you go from start with test and the questions and the theory and move to the data, or you can go from essentially start with the data and move up. Okay, so deductive strategies. So you use reason. So the logical content base uses reason and deductive logic to develop the personality measure. These tests, the test designer attempts to logically deduce the type of questions that should be asked to measure the hypothetical construct. Most tests you have taken, for the most part, are, at least that your faculty members have made, are developed using this logical approach. So it's not like it's total garbage at all, but it's less data driven initially. And garbage is a really strong word that I'm like to like downgrade a little. Anyway, so like these examples are I frequently worry about my weight, or I feel better after I've eaten a good meal. I was really hungry when I wrote these. True, false. So like they rely a lot on face validity, which is fine. It's my favorite kind of validity that's not a validity. Because what you see is what you get. It's classic Cosmo quiz as well. But honestly, it's a good place to start. Like, how else are you going to make the questions? You have to make them from something. And so here's the logical content type. And one reason why I actually like provide a study guide is to give me some structure so that I when I use that, because that's my sampling frame to make sure I cover all that what I'm covering is representative. But that's me trying to add a little more structure to the less structured type. Cool. So you can also start from the theoretical approach. So you start with theory. And you ask questions that are consistent with that theory. You assume every item on the scale is related to a characteristic you're measuring. So the goal is to attempt to create a homogeneous scale, a scale that is just tapping one construct. And once you make the scale, you have to collect data to check it. And so usually you use item analysis and factor analysis to confirm that the questions you ask actually relate. Some of the scale development I'm doing right now with an equity ethic measure, which is not a content area I specialize in, is kind of helping guide them through this, connecting the theoretical aspect and verifying that it lines up with the scale and the results. And so like I've been conducting factor analysis. I just finished the last series of analysis in the second wave. We had some tinkering with the first wave because some of the measure items were like a little ambiguous or didn't seem to tap nicely into the construct. And so we removed them, we modified them, we collected more data, and now we have a measure that looks pretty homogeneous, seems to only be tapping kind of that broad aspect. Cool. So yeah, and you have to look at the questions, and when I did my report, I looked at every single question and looked at distributions and all those pieces just to get a good sense of what these will look like. Cool. So awesome. Now empirical strategies. You can see which one I prefer. So there's a criterion group strategy, and so this is how the oh my goodness, I'm blanking right now. The MMPI. Oh my goodness. Wow. Pandemic brain is really hitting me hard. So you start with a known group. So this is criterion group. So you start with a known group of people who share a common characteristic that you're interested in identifying. It's gonna be like aggressiveness, depression. It doesn't have to be like a medical disorder. It can be you've identified people that are successful in their career and or are happy in their career. And so then you select and administer a group of questions to people in the criterion group, so the group you're interested in identifying, as well as a control group of just like general people. And then with that data, you find which questions distinguish well between your criterion group and your control group. And you keep the items that are best at distinguishing. And you can get some really weird, quirky things, like in the original MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Preferring a shower over a bath was really effective at distinguishing between people who had, I believe it was schizophrenia versus not, and people preferred to take a bath if they were not in this, like wouldn't have earned schizophrenia points. But it turns out that part of that was the reference groups had some issues. They used farm boys from Minnesota as their control group versus patients at an inner city or in the inner Twin Cities clients. So they as their like reference group. And so they were distinguishing both on if you had the disorder or not, as well as if you grew up in the country or not. And so baths indicated you grew up in the country, like out in the outside of cities, not like I mean everybody grew up in a country. But Bath is all about, this seems to be a more rural thing, and cities seems to be a more urban thing. And so one reason why that was really effective at distinguishing is there's this urban rural divide just built into the test. So it's really important to be mindful of your groups because they'll distinguish, but they may be distinguishing for the wrong reasons. So yeah, that's criterion. Let's see if I got more on this. Next, factor analysis. This is the one I most use. And so you use factor analysis to derive empirically, so derive from data the basic dimensions of personality. And so you ask a ton of questions and then you look for correlations among those questions. That's how we actually developed the Big Five, or discovered the Big Five factor structure. We call it the Big Five factor because we found, take a wild guess, how many factors? It's not 4. And depending on who you ask, it's not 6. It's probably 5. At least 5. There's debate on the 6th one. But that's a more modeling, nuanced question in my opinion. So, yeah, if you ask a lot of questions of your subjects and you see if there's an underlying structure where people who tend to score high on one aspect, so one factor, will score, you'll capture all the items that are tapping that factor will be highly correlated. So high scorers will score highly on all of those, and low scorers will score low on all of those as well. So then you can kind of uncover that dimension. It's easier with one factor, but you can do it with more. You can do it with a lot. It gets harder and you need more data, but and a lot of modeling. But the basic idea is you're trying to uncover the structure from the data. You're not imposing the structure on the data. So kind of as an example, we talked about this one way back in the day. It was the first personality inventory. It was initially designed to screen for shell shock, and it produced a single score, and it based itself on a really problematic assumption that responses could be taken at face value, that what they said was what they got, and so higher levels indicated more likely to be vulnerable to shell shock. But it was logic driven, not data driven. In theory, they could have done a criterion, a reference group. And this is what I imagine. This is what I would do if I were to have to create a shell shock screening questionnaire. I would find soldiers who experienced shell shock after their deployment, and identify soldiers who hadn't, and see if there were distinguishing factors. Ideally, you would have data pre-war, so like data before they went off to war, so like in their initial interview process or screening test, and then see, given the outcomes, if we could predict those. Now that takes time, and by the time this test was even the basic test was developed, war was over, which is good from a public health standpoint, but a little problematic from a test validity standpoint. But it was one of the first attempts. I encourage you to check out those examples way back in the dawn of pre-pandemic days. But the idea was there. Cool. So there's some other, they can do this with multi-dimensions. I showed you some, I believe in my, so if you check out the SAM talk I gave, that slide set I gave, there are examples of these inventories, because this is where you can repurpose those scales. But the idea for the Bell adjustment inventory was to look at adjustment in multiple areas of your life: home, social, emotional functioning, and Bernreuter, depending on how you, the initial, they did some rescaling. They tried to fix it but they ideally, I think the basic idea initially was they had questions related to 6 traits, and the most interpretable ones, that at least from now's perspective: introversion, confidence, and sociability. And these were developed in 1930s, which apparently I did not include here. Let me show you some terrible handwriting. 30s. Woo! Yeah. So the Mooney problem checklist is one of the few really old tests still in use in its initial excuse me. The other computer that is rendering right now just decided to go on vacation. Okay. Oof, it's almost done. So yeah, the Mooney problem checklist is really similar to the Woodworth. It's one of the few used today. Most tests from this age are not used in their initial form. A lot of the items, a lot of the questions have persisted. And so you can see this really cool trend where you can trace the history of some of the really old questions to see how long they lasted. And a couple of them from the Otis that I have still are out there. There's variants of them, but it's really cool. You can see that history. Okay, so these slides, it's about 29 minutes, which means it's gonna take forever to render. But I'm gonna stop here and wait for all these videos to render and upload. So I'll see you, well, you'll see me in the last video. wash your hands, and stay sane, I guess.